It's a real pleasure to chat today with my friend and longtime colleague, Dr. Ross Wadey. He's an associate professor of sports psychology at St. Mary's University in London, England. He's a leading expert, recognized as a world-renowned leader in the area of the psychology of sport injury. And recently, he's edited two books, one on the subject of growth after adversity in sport, and the other on the psychological aspects of sport injury. Great to chat with you today, Ross.
Absolute pleasure, Les. You know I love doing these things.
Well, thanks for taking the time. And maybe you can just talk a little bit about how you got interested in the field of sport injury, and in particular in the psychological aspects of injury.
Yeah, I've never been injured really. I've never really experienced a meaningful injury. So that's normally the route people come in. But originally when I first started academia, I was more interested in performance and how we can maximize performance. And particularly for me, it was about dealing with stress and anxiety. I didn't really handle my anxiety that well as an athlete. So that's what hooked me in, I guess, the sports psych. I finished my studies sort of undergraduate and masters, and I was a bit of a crossroads there. At the time, I was examining a concept called mental toughness, and it was quite a sexy subject at the time, quite critical of it now, but it was really in vogue at that time. But no PhD opportunities came around in that area. So Professor Lynn Evans at Cardiff Metropolitan University had an opportunity then about doing a PhD in injury. I had absolutely no interest in injury whatsoever. And then she sort of persuaded me though with her passion. I was really infected by her passion for the subject, and she really hooked me in. And it took me about 2-3 years to really, probably towards the end of my PhD, where I actually started to like the area and definitely thought it was something I wanted to pursue.
Yeah. So I guess just going back to your comment about mental toughness, you mentioned that it's a concept that was kind of a hot topic, but something that you're critical of. Maybe you can expand on why.
Yeah, so at the time when I was looking at it, I was really intrigued in it because for me it kind of helped understanding my own anxieties as an athlete. And I was thinking actually people who are more mentally tough are able to handle it better. So I was intrigued why these individuals can handle it better than certain other people. But I guess over time I've been quite critical of mental toughness. It's a very fuzzy subject, but it's Daniel Gucciardi's doing a lot of good research now about clarifying it. But I guess my interest has moved more towards psychosocial. So I'm kind of interested as mental toughness more as a cultural phenomenon. And I think it can actually do more harm than good. So if you put it in an injury context, those people are mentally tough, may push through pain a bit more. So it's sort of a catch-22, sort of a nexus between the two. It may help performance, but it could actually harm like well-being and actually, create worse injuries, I guess. Yeah. So it's a bit of a paradox.
Yeah. So kind of on the one hand, the idea that maybe it's a valued attribute, or that coaches or athletes see it as valuable for performance, but it's also that same quality that can maybe lead athletes to engage in excessive or unhealthy kinds of behaviors. Is that?
Definitely, yeah. And that's what we found. So my early studies were very helpful in making that link between mental toughness attributes and enhancing performance. And then I supervised a PhD, Dr. Francesca Cavalieri, and she looked at gymnastics and did an ethnography in an Italian gymnastics company, and she found mental toughness traits were really pushed on these athletes, and they were doing actually more harm than good. And I guess that sort of made me have a more critical gaze upon the concept.
Yeah. And so I guess you mentioned that idea of kind of the culture or the environment. And I guess I'm just wondering if, in certain cultures, mental toughness might lead to things like chronic injury, where the athlete is kind of pushing through pain or not accepting boundaries or limits. Is there some link that you know of between mental toughness or an environment that encourages it and chronic injury?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't observed that in my own research. I mean, Francesca's observed that this mental toughness can lead to overuse injuries, and these injuries actually getting worse. I mean, I haven't actually done this as such, but I've done a lot of work at the military, and I've seen lots of links there where there's quite a mental toughness, quite a hegemonic masculinity kind of cultures, and this can involve people pushing through, um, pushing through pain barriers and going beyond that kind of what will be a comfortable kind of threshold, really. And it can have sort of in the sort of aftermath of adversity or some kind of thing, it can be quite a challenge for them. They have sort of have this stiff upper lip, they suppress their emotions. So it can be sort of advantageous in certain contexts, but in others it can be quite a challenge. And again, I think it's a concept I haven't followed much in the last sort of 5 years. I know Dan Gucciardi's done some great research, and I know he's just shifted into the military. So
Right.
I'm sure some of his latest research will be quite, quite interesting.
Yeah. You mentioned Dr. Lynn Evans, who was your supervisor for your doctoral studies, and that she really had an interest or passion for the topic of injury, and that kind of as you progress through your own studies and research that you became, I guess, more enamored or interested in the topic. I guess what was it about sort of her enthusiasm, I guess, or interest in the topic that helped you kind of gain more interest in the topic?
Yeah, I think I mean, I got seduced by the mental toughness area, but I think deep down, I've never really been interested in performance. It's not something that I really resonated with. I think I just got swept away. I think Lynn's passion more towards athlete well-being. I've always been interested in things like health, well-being, whether it's athletes or non-athletes. I'm just generally interested in it. And I think that kind of must have flicked a switch in me maybe, or it sort of aligned with my own personal values a bit more. But yeah, I did a couple of years research with Lynn, and we did some sort of quite big quantitative studies, which I didn't really enjoy. And then I actually started doing some qualitative interviews, and I started hearing some stories then, and it was these stories that pulled me in. I remember one young lady that I interviewed for about 4 hours, and she just completely broke down in tears. Her life had shattered around her. Her coach didn't really care about her. Her teammates didn't really care. Her parents and her husband at the time, I think it was a husband, didn't really understand the meaning of the injury to her. And I just saw this very fragile young lady in front of me. And I think that's about the time when I started to want to become an advocate for injured athletes and try and help them if I could.
Yeah. So you mentioned that kind of interest in well-being, and I guess certainly injury would fall into that category. What does the term well-being mean for you? Because I guess it's quite broad and could entail a lot of things. Or what does
Yeah,
well-being mean for you?
yeah. I mean, I guess I'm very influenced by the broader literature on that I've read around subjective and psychological well-being. So I guess in terms of subjective well-being, it's I guess it is interested with the concept of happiness, so more positive affect and sort of less negative affect. Although I'm more interested in sort of paradoxical thinking now, where you can have, I think it's a bit naive to think that everyone's going to be in this positive bubble or negative. Life's a bit more complex. And then psychological well-being as well, looking at the common concepts, which is like which are very much psychological based. Although so things like autonomy, positive relationships with others, personal growth. Those are kind of concepts, I guess, for me that would reflect psychological well-being. For me, I'm also very much interested in social well-being, so shifting away from just an individual perspective and looking at the broader relationships and culture that surround athletes.
Yeah. You mentioned this idea of growth as an element or component of well-being. And as I mentioned at the start of our chat, you recently, along with colleagues Melissa Day and Karen Howells, edited a book on the topic of growth. Maybe you can clarify what that idea or concept of growth after adversity is or means.
Yeah, so it's in a concept that I picked up, I think it was around 2010 or something like that. So I was getting into the injury literature at the time, and I found it quite dark and gloomy, to be honest, which is fine because no one wants to get injured, and it is a dark time. But I read an article by Elaine Udry in 1997. I think it was one of her PhD studies that sort of found that injured athletes can come back kind of stronger. So you go through a dark time, and out the other side of it, you can experience kind of some growth. It may be that you become more resilient. It may be that you strengthen relationships around you. And you sort of perhaps improve your coping resources, or perhaps find yourself a little bit more. It can be quite an enlightening period. Darker times in our lives, we can find that. And I thought it was quite a novel concept at the time as a way of helping athletes. So perhaps if you can gain something, it may be that this could lead on to them improving performance in sport. It could lead on them preventing them to get injured because they're more resilient. There's certain things that I thought could be quite a helpful concept. So we started looking into it over a couple of years now. I've tried to theorize about it and create some interventions to help injured athletes come back better than what they were prior to their injury. But I've got with the book, I had a number of ideas, and I spoke to Karen Howells, who'd just done a PhD on it, and Melissa Day, who I always work with really. And we were quite critical of the concept. So it's quite a neoliberal concept. So everything's about the self. So the injured athlete, how can the injured athlete come back stronger? But we wanted to push it actually and go beyond the individual. So how can relationships potentially come back stronger? How can teams come back stronger? How can organizations come back stronger? How can we change cultures? Because there's more and more things coming out in the media now and in the academic literature saying the darker side of sport. There's toxic cultures, there's organizations that don't really have the right policies and practices. There's groups, that aren't working well together. And we thought, actually, let's push this growth concept beyond the individual, which mainstream psychology hasn't really done. If I give you an injury example, because I know that's what we're talking about today, what can we learn about from injuries that can create change in policies and practices? There's a really nice example in Canada at the moment. For example, there was a young lady who suffered a tragic death. She had a relentless number of concussions in sport, and because of that horrific injury, these repeated concussions, they start to change policies and practices in Canada now. So if anyone's seen to have a concussion, you have to come off the pitch, and everyone needs to get training in concussion now. So it's not just looking at positive change that may happen to the individual, it's pushing it as well. What can we create change in policies and practice to protect athletes? And that's the way I sort of see the concept going. And that's what we tried to push with the book, as well as being very critical of the concept as well. Because it can do good, but it can do bad. So.
Right. So I want to pick up on that latter point. But I think it's really interesting that, you had an interest in kind of extending this idea of growth beyond just the individual to things like organizations, teams, maybe individuals working with the athletes who may experience some form of adversity. How do you, and I think your example of a policy change as an indicator of growth is a great example. I'm wondering how you measure growth, either in an individual level or some of the other levels that you just referred to.
Yeah, it's a good question. So the area of literature is, to be honest, quite in its infancy. So there's hundreds of measures out there to measure at an individual level. So we have typical psychometric scales. there's not that many developed in sport, but we do have ones that we can use upon that. But the indicators of growth are very much different depending on what level you're focusing at. Sort of like a dyad level, looking at relationships, and looking at is the relationship perhaps more reciprocal, and then at a team level, looking at collective functioning, an organizational, looking at policies and practices, and at a cultural level, they can mean different things. So there's, if you take a quantitative approach, there's a hell of a lot of scope to develop more psychometric measures. For me, taking a more qualitative approach, it would very much be, using as many different sort of data collection methods as possible to provide as much robust evidence that change has happened. So that would be my guess, but that would be a really interesting future area of research, Les, to try and push the measurement of the concept.
Yeah. So to your last point, Ross, you mentioned that implicit in this idea of growth is the notion that change has occurred.
Yeah.
Why is that important? Like, why is it important for the athlete to say or to experience some kind of change?
Yeah, I think if you keep it at an individual level, I mean, a lot of the athletes, when I was a practitioner, the people I work with, very much didn't have time to stop and reflect. And I think injury, for example, when I did consult with a lot of injured athletes, this was an opportunity for them to stop and reflect and get off the treadmill. It can derail them for a bit. And it may be that, from consultations or work, that actually they've reflected and they're happy with where they were prior to the injury, and we get them back on the tracks, hopefully, and things can tick along like they were. But for some, it's nice to perhaps stop and think about ways that they may change. We may find a different journey, we might find a different trajectory for them where they could be much happier. And I would reinforce that, psychological well-being could be a really valuable thing to have. And it may be that, they go on to be happier, they may go on to have more autonomy, they go on to have stronger relationships, all things that are, I would say, valuable qualities.
Right.
But changes beyond the individual are so important as well. I mean, if you look at the culture of gymnastics right now, that's getting a lot of media coverage. It's horrendous what these young girls have been through. So we need to stop and reflect with these broader national governing bodies and think about how can we stop abuse? How can we stop these toxic cultures? And how can we bring around change to make sport a beautiful sport, and to make it a sport that I would want my daughter to go into, because at the moment I wouldn't recommend that she does.
Yeah. We talked also a little bit about this idea that growth seems to entail this notion that someone is somehow stronger as a consequence of having had maybe a dark period or some form of adversity. And I was just kind of thinking about the comment you made earlier in relation to the concept of mental toughness, how it can be maybe a double-edged sword, maybe helpful in some ways for the athlete, but at times counterproductive. And I wonder in some ways if the same doesn't apply to this notion of growth. More specifically, that, there's this sort of cultural narrative or storyline that one should be stronger or better. And I wonder if on some level that has problems or limitations to it as a kind of storyline.
Yeah, it's something that I at the time when I originally took it up, the concept, I didn't foresee this, but it's over time reading more, and to be honest, chatting to a lot more sociologists as well, and far more critical psychologists, and having those conversations with them, I've been able to develop my understanding of it. But my biggest fault with it is that it is quite neoliberal, that it always emphasizes that the individual has to come back stronger. And we hopefully challenge that with the book, whereas actually we need to stop pointing the finger at the individual. Other concepts is that it can raise significant expectations. So injuries a horrible thing, and I wouldn't wish it upon anybody. And you can and it can be life transforming for negative reasons as well. And it's almost with this concept of growth, it's not good enough just to recover anymore. You won't get a pat on the back if you just recover. You have to come back stronger, and I think that places huge expectations on athletes, which I think is wrong. I also worry about these people who don't experience growth. So they could be seen as failures. They clearly aren't coping right. They don't have the right qualities, and I'd hate for them to be stigmatized against because of that. So that's another downside of it. So it is again a very much a paradox. There's good, it can do good and it can do bad.
Yeah. Just as you were talking, I was thinking about the comments of a colleague that I interviewed, Dr. Christian Zepp from the German Sport University. And he says that sometimes he feels sort of this idea of coming back stronger as something of a cliche in some ways, and that that when you experience difficulty or challenge, adversity, that you're going to be different, not necessarily stronger, but that you're, by virtue of having had that experience, you're changed in some way. You're different. And, and on some level, I guess I'm wondering if, whether the person is quote unquote stronger is as relevant as, do they have tools or strategies to cope effectively with the challenge? And maybe the issue is less about, well, are you stronger in some ways? And do you have ways and means to get through whatever challenge, whether it's injury or some other form of adversity? I know in the literature there's discussion or debate about how we actually assess whether people are in fact stronger. Some people might say it doesn't, if you perceive you are, that's what counts. Others might say, well, it's more important to have objective indicators that someone has actually changed in some way, shape, or form. Just comments, I guess.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point. So it's a debate I often have with Karen Howes. So Karen's got some great research in this area. So if I talk about the cultural phenomenon, so growth can mean different things to individuals. So what psychologists deem growth is quite different from like sociologists. But it is a classic narrative. It's a storyline out there. It's a storyline that's in most books. It's a storyline that's in most films. A classic one for me would be Rocky. Something if Rocky never came back in the end and defeated everyone at the end, the story would never be produced. If Lance Armstrong didn't come back and win those Tour de France, his book would never be published. It's a storyline that we like to keep reinforcing. And what Karen Howes has found in some of her research is that people just perform the storyline. It becomes internalized because they see it everywhere. And they just tell me that, I have grown. But in her research, she's challenged them. And she's like, well, what do you mean? Show me that you've grown. In what ways? And she's realized that people actually may not be genuine in what they've experienced, and they're just performing. So if you go to like Goffman's research in sociology, people are just performing this storyline, I guess. But I think coping's a really interesting one. I mean, what's a downside for me in a lot of the literature around growth is that we typically only look at one isolated event. So you experience one adversity, and then we ask you, have you experienced growth? Something I tried to do in a recent article I published is looked at growth following a number of adversities. So what we were able to find out is that those people who have experienced a moderate amount of adversity were able to cope better with future adversity because they developed the coping strategies, they developed certain things that they were able to use in the future. And they only realized that they'd grown actually when they experienced the next adversity.
Yeah.
We did find those that experienced lots of adversity, though, eventually ended up suffering mental health in the end. And actually, this came a real snowball effect and things went downhill quite quickly. So again, it's an interesting thing about how much kind of adversity you've experienced in the past.
Right. Like maybe at a certain point, there's a threshold after which, if you continue to experience chronic or maybe significant stressors or adversity, that it becomes less than helpful. But that point about kind of developing some coping skills for the next challenge as being important. I think also implicit in your comment, Ross, is this idea that, you know, sometimes we think of growth as an end unto itself or an end point, right? Like, I've reached this enlightened state where, you know, I've grown as an individual, and therefore whatever challenges come my way are less, you know, challenging or affect me less so. But sort of more the notion that, you know, it's always something of a work in progress, I guess, right? Like, there's always going to be the next challenge, and if you have some skills that you've developed, then maybe you're better equipped to deal with those subsequent challenges or forms of adversity.
Definitely. I couldn't agree more or less. Yeah, the story's never over. So
yeah. And I guess in terms of, you know, injury as a specific challenge, well, certainly this is a little bit more specific. One challenge that commonly comes up with athletes is they're apprehensive or worried about getting hurt again. And I'm wondering, either from a research standpoint or from an applied standpoint, what are some ways or strategies in particular that a practitioner might use, that you use with athletes, or how do you help the athlete who has that kind of adversity or that particular challenge? They're worried about getting hurt again.
yeah, yeah, I'd probably ask you that question, Liz. I'd say you're more the expert on that, but I think it's a really important point, and it's something that I'd say your research, very much groundbreaking research, has started to unpick this about this return to phase to recovery, which sort of kicked off, I think it was around 2004, 2006, when your research started to come to play, and about this thing called psychological readiness, which is getting a lot more attention now. But yeah, it's a great, I really enjoy the area. I think the more stuff I do in practice, though, it's really hard to deliver in practice, because there's so many pressures for athletes to come back. They get pressures from the culture, pressures from the coaches, teammates need them back, and so if we can get them psychologically ready and get reduce this anxiety, I think great. I mean, a lot of the time when I did applied consultancy, was just making athletes comfortable with their anxiety, and recognizing that they're experiencing it, and being okay with that, and, you know, really unpicking what this anxiety means to them, going a bit further about what lies underneath this anxiety. You know, what would I sort of just like the deeper kind of more Socratic kind of approach, where you really start to unpick. It is an emotion, but what's the real deep, you know, perhaps it's an identity issue that's underlying it. Perhaps there may be some sort of existential crisis underneath, you know, if they do get injured again, what's the concern? A lot of the time I do spend time with athletes. I mean, a lot of them, to be honest, have the strategies. They've learned all these psychological skills in performance contexts, so they just cross over, they're just not aware of it. The one thing I normally work with them on, though, and that they don't normally do, is really getting that mind-body connections, that body-self relationship, and really listening to their body. And, you know, what is your body saying, telling you now? Is it, you know, is that good pain? Is it bad pain? Describe that pain. Where are you now? And getting them to really understand their body. And I think, and enabling them to make that decision if they possibly can, when they feel they're psychologically ready to return. But it is very much a multidisciplinary decision, and that's, you know, and hopefully maybe even a transdisciplinary decision moving forward, but getting everyone on the table, getting the physio there, getting the athlete there, getting the strength and conditioning coach, physiotherapist, all these individuals need to come round and really make this informed decision. That's, for me, would be the best practice here.
Yeah. So, you know, I really like how, you know, you mentioned that, you know, sometimes apprehensions or concerns may relate to a variety of underlining things. I mean, in some instances, it may just be, well, physically, there may be legitimate reasons why someone's apprehensive or ambivalent because physically maybe they just need more time to recover. But on the other hand, maybe it's about, concerns about their identity or unfulfilled potential, or something related to the meaning and the role of sport in their lives, and what purpose it serves for them, and the prospect of not being able to do something that's self-fulfilling, self-defining, self-rewarding, those kinds of things. So I think that sounds important, that I guess you're having some of those discussions to get the athlete reflecting on some of those maybe more philosophical issues, or reflecting on the meaning of the injury, or what implications it has for them moving forward. I guess also, in terms of your point about readiness, it definitely seems like it's a complicated concept, and sometimes I have probably more questions than definitive answers about what it actually it means to be ready. I also more and more, we talked about that idea that athletes internalize cultural beliefs a lot, and my sense is for a lot of athletes, maybe that their desire to return can be quite intense, and maybe their sort of judgment can be clouded. And so, if you just ask an athlete, do you feel ready to return? They may say yes, because that's the right thing to say, because they think other people want to hear that, because that's what a tough athlete does.
Yeah.
And in some ways, I also wonder whether more sort of indirect assessments or indicators of whether someone is ready might be useful. So for example, if you ask the athlete to, if you give them a choice and say, do you want to do this more assertive kind of behavior, and you don't necessarily tell them that, but you say, okay, well, do you prefer to do this, or maybe something that's not quite as intense, and they choose the less intense thing, maybe that's an indicator that they're not quite as ready, or maybe just more sort of behavioral things in terms of how they're carrying themselves, or again, what kinds of activities they're willing to do or not willing to do. So yeah, I guess definitely an area probably that requires more investigation, and looking into what the implications are too.
That's normally where I sit there, so that latter part. When you really know an athlete, you sort of just know when they're ready. You can see it in their eyes. You can see it in perhaps in their body language. It's little indicators like that when you really know someone. You can hear it in their language. It's whether they're a bit more, less looking in the past, thinking more in the future. And you can sort of just tell.
Yeah.
But sometimes we get it wrong, and that's okay. I had a really great chat with Rennie and Neil the other day, who was really honest and open in her conversations. That she worked with an athlete and she did everything she thought was right, but the athlete got re-injured, and that hit her hard as an applied sports psychologist.
Yeah.
You feel you haven't done your job right, but we can't always get it right.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Go ahead. Sorry.
No, I just think these little nuanced kind of little things, when you really develop a relationship with someone, you can sort of just tell. But there is always a risk to it. I mean, look, I think in your research as well as mine, there's the best way to find if you're psychologically, well, for me, always the biggest indicator is when you're going through a real tough challenge and your injury withstands it. That's the best kind of confirmation that it's okay. But obviously, we need to simulate that as much as we can in order to prepare for that moment. But that kind of moment sort of validates to the athlete that they are physically and psychologically, in a good place right there.
Yeah, and though, of course, sport is, if nothing else, physical, right? And so athletes gain confidence from being able to do things. And certainly in the case of injury, when they haven't been able to do things, getting that validation may be important. I guess in terms of this idea of readiness, sometimes I also wonder, well, does it even really matter? Like it's probably pretty legitimate, understandable that particularly after some absence, potentially a prolonged absence, that you will have uncertainties and apprehensions, fears, worries. But maybe for some athletes, you go out and over a period of time, as you alluded to, you test it and realize, well, my concerns were unfounded, or my body can withstand the rigors and demands of sport. And, you know, or maybe that's not the case. Maybe it's for some athletes, you know, they have apprehension that may be more debilitating once they get out and compete or perform, or they don't get that validation that the body is ready.
What's
So
important though is that you give that athlete a voice. I think what's typically always happened is you get that tick box from the physio or the doctor that everything's all right. And I think always historically, no one's given that athlete the voice. If they are really struggling, it's something we should address. And it may just be, go back and eventually you'll kind of eventually find your way. But I think it's really important that athletes' voices are heard. If you are struggling, it's important that we speak up. And as psychology's getting more and more accepted in sport, I think it's really important that we have athletes at the table and that are talking, and they feel that their voice is being heard by the multidisciplinary team around them.
yeah. But having said that, I mean, do you think there's also the tendency for the athlete to want to keep a stiff upper lip and, say everything is fine, or, like, no,
Yeah,
I'm okay?
of course, I think that is, and again, it comes back to knowing your athlete. I think, but then I think you have to have a good, tough chat with your athlete. It's sort of the short-term versus long-term debate. It's like, okay, you can go back now, and you may be okay this game, but if you go back and you re-injure yourself for another 9 months, then your contract may end. And it's making that, and it's not always a clear-cut decision, but you have to. And again, I would always typically favour the long-term approach. I'd always want to enhance the sustainability of athletes' careers and that. But sometimes in my work, we've had to go for the short term because they've had to compete in order to get Olympic qualifications. They've had to do this short-term thing, and that's just the nature of sport and the timings of things and just the context around them. But having that decision about the long-term and short-term is always a critical one for me.
Right. So, yeah, kind of being aware of those two pieces, I guess. And I was going to ask, I mean, would you say that sometimes those two are at odds, the long-term well-being with the short-term need to compete, maybe, as you say, for a big competition, an Olympics or something else? Are they incongruent?
Yeah, typically they are. And it's not an easy decision, but it's something that the decision, for me, always, I try and make the athlete come to it. And for me, it can be quite a simple intervention. I mean, sometimes I've just got an athlete to write a letter to themselves and actually just say, write a letter to yourself, just saying, I've made this decision for this reason, and that's why. And it's something they can come back, and, it's something that they can work through themselves. It's just a little thing like that.
Yeah. It sounds like in your applied work with athletes, Ross, that you get the athletes to do a lot of self-reflection. Would that be accurate?
I do. I also get them. I mean, I don't do much consulting now because I've got a family, so I haven't got the time. But I also did a lot of get them to do a lot of social reflection as well. I don't like it when athletes are constantly blamed or they internalize the issues and things like that. It's just, perhaps you're not the issue here. Perhaps the culture is the issue. Perhaps your overbearing coach is the issue here. Perhaps, so making them aware that actually it's not always them that is the problem.
Yeah.
Typically athletes always say, what's wrong with me? I'm like, there's probably nothing wrong with you. You're a lovely person. It's just, you're in a really bad environment right now.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm kind of thinking, you have referred to this idea that sometimes we kind of locate the problem, if you will, or issue on the shoulders of the individual. And as you seem to be suggesting that maybe it's a larger cultural or subcultural issue, something related to the sport or the team or
Yeah.
the broader environment that either the athlete internalizes or may just exist kind of outside of the athlete, but that the outside observer may sort of have the tendency to put on to the athlete. And, I'm just thinking of, this is unrelated, but sort of this idea of drug taking in sport, right? That it's somehow a moral failure on the part of the athlete if they're, they made a bad choice, right? It's always about the athlete making a poor choice as opposed to, well, what's the context in which they're operating? What are the norms? What's being encouraged? Maybe they're deferring to authority. I know in Australia, I guess some time ago, there was a case of one of the, I think the Australian rules football teams where basically one of the, I think, exercise physiologist was kind of administering substances to the athletes that I don't even know if they were aware of it, but of what they were ingesting. But, maybe there's a tendency to defer to authority. So if someone says, here, take this, it's going to enhance your performance, you don't question the coach kind of thing, but you follow along and do as you're told.
Yeah.
I guess in terms of ways to support on that note, from a coaching standpoint, or in terms of people in managerial roles within a team, are there things that those individuals can do to support an athlete through adversity, injury, or some other form of adversity?
Yeah, I think I really do think they can. I mean, one of your colleagues, Les, wrote a great is it John Neal? How do you pronounce his surname? Sorry, it's John
Heil.
Sorry.
Yeah, that's okay.
I've been getting his name wrong for 20 years. John Hart, I mean, he wrote a fantastic article, I think it was in 2016, about the role of advocacy and sports psychologists being advocates for their athletes and challenging bad practices, challenging bad, policies and things like that. And I think there is a role for that. And I know some sports psychology governing bodies have given guidelines around advocacy and supporting athletes, but there are obviously very much downsides to this. It's challenging the culture that you're in, challenging the people that perhaps pay your wages. It's being a whistleblower. It's not an easy decision process to go about, but I think John wrote a fantastic paper about how we can better support the athletes.
Yeah.
And I think the way that hopefully sports psychology is moving on is that, it doesn't locate always the problem with the individual. And I think that's where the importance of interdisciplinary research is, whether it is more psychosocial, cultural, and really start bridging these to understand the complexities of the issues. And, where the issues, do lie. Maybe they do lie in the individual, but maybe they don't in certain circumstances.
Yeah, so certainly, I suppose, irrespective of where issues may sort of originate, certainly in the case of injury, of course, it can have a big impact or a profound one on the athlete themselves. And I guess from your standpoint, either as a researcher, practitioner, are there things that athletes can do to help themselves recover effectively, to cope well, maybe to experience some form of growth?
Yeah, I think, there's definitely things that athletes can do. I think the first thing I normally struggle with injured athletes is helping them to understand what they're thinking and feeling. A lot of the time they're not self-aware of this. Normally they are putting up a front and giving them a space to breathe, giving them a space to tell their story. I mean, for anyone not familiar with this area, I'll give you an example to sort of illustrate this. So let's pretend we've got a this is a fictitious example. So let's pretend we've got a young athlete called Lisa who's got an ACL injury. She's been out, she's been told she's going to be out for 6-9 months. And perhaps she's like 8 weeks into her rehab and she's missing her teammates. So she walks back in to see her teammates. And she walks in and everyone walks up to her and sort of says, how are you, Lisa? So Lisa goes, fantastic, recovery's going really well, making loads of progress. The doctor's really happy with me. The surgeon's happy. The physio thinks I'm going to be perhaps returning a bit sooner than normal. And this is a story, for example, that people want to hear, and a storyline that people will celebrate. But let's imagine Lisa goes in and perhaps is a bit more honest. And she goes, and everyone goes, how are you today, Lisa? I'm not good. I spent all last night crying. I nearly considered self-harming. I slipped in the bath and I've made my injury worse. I'm going to be out for another 3 months. I burnt myself on the kettle trying to make a cup of tea. I don't know who I am anymore. And just imagine how that story would be received by those teammates. People wouldn't know what to do. People feel awkward. It's a storyline that's not welcomed in sport. It's not tough. It's not positive. So at somewhere, we need athletes to share their stories. We need them to talk, to get that out and understand where they are and why they're there. And I guess for me, that first bit of being self-aware and giving them, for me, it's giving them permission to talk and permission to be negative and getting them to be okay with that. I think that's the first thing I normally do. And then I try to sort of understand the broader context around these decisions, why they talk, perhaps why they're reacting the way they're reacting. And then perhaps considering things they could do. What opportunities are potentially available to them? Is there anything that they can do? Most athletes, not all, sometimes normally have a bit more time during their rehab. So what could they be doing in that time to maximize that time? And that's where sort of opportunities arise. I would never obviously prescribe growth. I couldn't recommend never tell an athlete they're going to experience growth because they will bite your head off. It's something they don't want to hear. The timing of the concept is really important. And I probably won't do it till they're well gone and have returned, really, if I ever bring it up. But I think, a lot of self-awareness. I guess I keep coming back to that concept, but I think that's really important.
Yeah. How do you go about giving them license to voice the fact that they may not be feeling positive or, that things might not be going well? How do you create that opportunity for them to voice those negative thoughts, feelings, emotions?
Yeah, this is obviously predicated on the assumption that they can articulate how they're feeling. Research I've done with Francesca Cavallari is that young athletes actually don't have the words. They don't have the words to talk or express how they're feeling. So the first thing I try to do is create. If they can't speak about it, there's so many other mediums that you can try. Like, if they need to draw a picture, they need to, if there's any way of them talking or getting it out of them, I try and mobilize. If there's a song that reflects how you're feeling, let's listen to the song together. If there's a story or a news article that helps you, if you want to do a painting, if you want any way to get it out of you, that's, I think, the first thing. But it largely comes down to, I think it's sort of your alliance with the athlete. They need to trust me. They need to make sure that I'm a good guy, that I'm not going to go tell their coach, tell their physio, tell anyone that this is a safe space. But that comes with time. So it may be that, normally when I did consultancy, normally the first 6 sessions are a waste of time. I don't get much. I know they're just performing for me, but I know this is a process that they're going through. And once they sort of suss me out, then it normally comes unexpected and they suddenly offload.
It's that sort of trust factor or building that relationship and the rapport where they know that, okay, you're someone that they can divulge information to, and and then once you get that level of security or comfort, or the athlete perceives it, then maybe through different means, you mentioned, whether it's just you know, drawing a picture, you know, listening to a song, you know, like, is there a newspaper article out there that is of interest to you at the moment? Like
Yeah,
something other than just maybe getting them to talk,
yeah,
but something that maybe helps generate some sort of, um, I guess, indication of how they're feeling at the time, then opens that possibility to explore sort of what it means to them or how they're experiencing something.
definitely. And I think the context helped as well. Think about where your consultations are. If you're having it in a sporting environment, highly likely they're not going to open up in case anyone overhears. So think about a safe space outside of sport.
Yeah.
And think about like where you're sat as well. And if you're in a coffee shop, you know, sit them so they're facing the wall. No, you know, facing you and to the wall. So there's not 100 people around them distracting them. And obviously, I mean, I always ask the athlete or the individual where they would like to have a consultation.
Yeah.
And if they sort of veer toward more private spaces, you sort of potentially, you know, I'm sort of thinking maybe they are going to open up a bit more. But those kind of things have helped me.
From a research standpoint, in terms of injury, what are some things that excite or interest you as areas to further examine or look at? Are there sort of broad areas, I guess, that are of interest to you at the moment?
Yeah, I think there needs to be a lot more research. I don't know. Yeah, I'll be interested. I think a broad area that would interest me is really mental health at the moment. How can we really support injured athletes and their mental health? Those that are suffering. And I think they warrant our, you know, our research attention to help best support them.
Mm-hmm.
Again, I think it may be exploring beyond the individual. You know, how do we create really great rehabilitation environments?
Yeah.
Things like that. Not just more research around psychological skills and injured athletes. I think we've done that. We could probably refine it a bit more, but I think moving beyond that now, and how to build practitioner relationships, how to work in multidisciplinary teams.
Right.
I think those kind of questions those are the ones that will probably keep me up at night.
Yeah.
And a big thing as well, I don't think there's enough in prevention. How can we really prevent injury? And I think that, yeah, I mean, they're tough questions.
Yeah.
So I think those are probably the ones that
Yeah.
immediately come to mind.
Right. Yeah, and I appreciate how, you know, I guess maybe a running theme of our conversation, Ross, is this idea that it's, you know, these things, whether it's injury again or some other challenge, that it's not just at the individual level, but of course there's a multitude of interactions on a social level, teammates to other injured or non-injured teammates, with coaches, with practitioners, that there's a cultural and subcultural environment in which, you know, an injury happens to the individual. So on some level, it's not just an individual experience, but very much a social phenomenon. And also, you know, you talked a lot about some of these larger kind of narratives that operate within society, and how that, you know, may come to bear on the individual as well. So yeah, I think lots of interesting questions and topics to explore. Are there kind of other points, I guess, in terms of the injury experience that we haven't discussed that you feel are important or salient, either for the athlete or someone sort of working in a practitioner role?
Uh, I mean, obviously, this is an area I could talk about all day, Les. There's loads more. Well, I'd just like to say that Les did send me a rough interview guide prior to this, and he hasn't asked many of the questions on there, which is why I love Les. But no, I think yeah, I'm happy with that, Les. And this is any questions you may have, yeah, I'm happy to wrap it up there unless you do have any other ones.
Yeah, well, you know, I guess in terms of some of the questions I sent, they're certainly focused more on the individual
Yeah, yeah, no,
right?
yeah,
And how the athlete may experience things,
yeah,
or, the role of some of those
yeah.
things like motivation, or, and yeah, so, I appreciate the conversation having a different focus as
I knew it would.
well.
I knew it would. Yeah.
But I very much appreciate your time, Dr. Wadey, and it,
I
as all,
will. I will actually, Les. I will
yeah,
answer one of your questions.
yeah, for
So
sure.
Les's last question, he did ask. He said he was going to say, if you were to share one piece of advice for injured athletes, what would that be?
Yeah,
So one piece of advice is to look after your body. You only get one of them. So that would be my biggest advice.
yeah, I think those are sage words of wisdom. And, earlier you'd mentioned that idea of listening to your body, right? And certainly athletes, either through, norms or beliefs that get internalized, or just their interest in achieving goals and getting back quickly. I mean, we didn't really talk. I mean, we talked a little bit about that issue, I guess, of time, or sort of this issue of expediency, and kind of the
Yeah,
future being now, right? I've got to come back for this big competition. And maybe at times that's at odds with the idea of taking care of your body or listening to your body. So I think striking that balance seems important, right? Like, how does the athlete, on the one hand, kind of work to better themselves physically and heal and compete in big competitions, but also, not continually put their bodies at risk, or do things that may, incur lifelong damage. So the story you mentioned of concussion, I guess, certainly being one example. Um, yeah, thanks again for your thoughts, Ross. And again, I really
absolute
appreciate
pleasure.
our discussion. So finish
Lovely
it
to see
there.
you. Lovely to see your face, Les. I've missed it.
Thanks for the kind words.